Good evening, everyone. I'm Tom Kulaga, Executive Creative Director of the New York Times Live Conversation series, TimesTalks. I am delighted to welcome you to tonight's conversation with the legendary Robert Caro, two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning author, yes, of The Power Broker, and his multi-volume magnum opus, The Years of Lyndon Johnson. His new book, Working, published today by Knopf, gives us a glimpse into his own life and work in evocatively written personal pieces. Copies of Working will be for sale on the lobby after tonight's discussion, and Mr. Caro will be on hand to sign them. Moderating tonight's event is Parul Sehgal, a book critic for the New York Times, who also wrote the recent memorable cover profile of the actress Glenda Jackson for the New York Times Magazine. Parul tweeted yesterday that, quote, "When I edited Robert Caro, we disagreed over the placement of a single semicolon for close to 30 minutes. Parentheses, he won." Tonight we have the distinct privilege of hearing them continue that debate. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Parul Sehgal, and our special guest, Robert Caro.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, pleasure.
Just wanted to let you know we're going to talk for about 40 minutes, and we'll have 20 minutes left for questions, after which Bob's going to sign some books in the lobby. So I wanted to begin by asking you to settle a confusion for me.
Okay.
So you're frequently described as our greatest living biographer, the last of the great 19th century biographers, for whom one volume of a life is not enough. We need a shelf. But I was startled to read that you don't consider these books conventional biographies.
That's right.
How would you describe them?
Well, I've never thought of my books as just biographies. I never had the slightest interest in writing a book just to tell the life of a great man. What I was interested from the start was talking about political power. And I thought if I found the right man to do it, I could explain a lot about political power through that life.
But then this also leads us into interesting terrain.
Okay.
Because, and I hope you won't cringe if I use this word, because your books to me also feel intimate. I feel like I know these men.
Thank you.
But I wonder, and you're not somebody who goes in for psychobiography telling us necessarily what Robert Moses felt. So tell me a little bit about that technique. How are you bringing us close to these lives?
Well, mostly, that's a good question. It's mostly by interviewing people about them. Oh, of course, Robert Moses, for a couple of years, he wouldn't talk to me at all. But then we did have 7 interviews, which basically went on the first 6 went on for hours and hours. The last one only lasted until I started asking him a question that he didn't like. And that was the end of it. So I got a real glimpse into him personally. Johnson, of course, was dead before I started. What you do is you try and interview people who knew him. See, I was very lucky. He died so young. He died at 64, and he would have been only 67 when I started these books. So all the people in his class, in the entire Johnson City High School, which it was 16 people, they were all still alive, and most of them were living, in fact, in Johnson City. So you could talk to them about what he was like growing up. Then you could talk to his college classmates, and of course you talk to his staff and the people who knew him throughout his life. And after a while, talking about a lot of interviews and several years, you do get a feeling that you were able to describe him as he was.
Yeah. But you're making interviews sound easy. I mean, how are you getting these people to talk to you? Is the question that I think all of us have when we read these books. Like these, I'm sure Johnson's staff was loyal, secretive even, possessive.
Yes.
How are you eliciting these? Give me the secrets, Bob. Don't hold back.
I don't have a secret. I have a question that I keep asking until people get angry is, what if I was standing next to you, what would I see? So you could ask that question over and over again, like one of his staff members, Horace Busby, who in the days before Bill Moyers, he was the closest staffer to Lyndon Johnson. So I think I had 22 formal interviews with him. And he would get we became good friends, but he would get so angry at me. I would keep saying, well, if I was there with you during this scene, what would I see, you know? Probably a good example of what you can get through that is not the best example I can think of at this moment isn't with Horace Busby, but with a man named Joseph Califano, who is the chief of Johnson's domestic staff. And he was with Johnson in the Oval Office a lot. And I would say to him, you know, what do you see? I said, well, what do you mean? He would get up, he'd walk around. I'd say, well, when he was walking around, what would you see? And he also would get really annoyed with me. And he said, well, sometimes he would go over. Now, Johnson was so addicted to the news that he had 3 wire tickers, Associated Press, United Press, and INS, installed right in the Oval Office. And he'd say, well, he'd go over to the tickers and he'd read them. And I'd say, well, how would he read them? If I was standing next to you, Joe, what would I see? And, you know, after several of him getting annoyed at that, he said, well, you know, there was something. It's like he couldn't wait for the news to come out. He'd bend over the tickers and take the pieces of paper coming out in 2 hands as if he could pull the news out faster. So you get glimpses of that, of what he was really like.
Yeah, you get glimpses and you also get gestures.
Yes.
You know, and I think that that's something that in your book, which I'm so grateful for because I think it also allows us as your readers and as readers and students of writing and writers to think about you as a stylist.
Well, thank you.
You know, and to think about your achievement as not only being an achievement, a historical achievement, but a literary achievement. And I wanted to ask you about just about how you construct scenes, for example. You seem to have this preternatural ability to find the right illustrative scene.
I don't think I'll interrupt you. I'll let you just
I can just
talking.
monologue about what you can do.
But you do. I think it's really, well, one of the things you work out, you know, I sound like I know what I'm talking about, but anything you work out as you're doing the book. As I was doing The Power Broker, I was saying, you know, if I want people to see Robert Moses when he was young, or when he was dreaming of Jones Beach, or this amazing, because during the interviews with him, you really see this really forceful, unusual personality. He was 78 when I was talking to him. And you just were overwhelmed. You know, can I tell you something where he was? So I would interview him. Beyond Jones Beach is a little summer colony called Oak Beach, and he had a rather modest summer home there. And what he had done was he had torn out 2 of the walls in the living room and replaced them with just glass. So if you looked out the left-hand window, you saw Robert Moses Causeway, the Robert Moses Bridge over the Fire Island. If you looked out the right-hand window, you saw the tower of Robert Moses State Park. And he would sit in the corner in this big leather chair. So when you were interviewing him, you were interviewing Robert Moses framed by his monument.
Flanked by his achievements.
Framed by his achievements.
Framed by his achievements. So your book is full of sort of gems, advice you've learned along the way. None that's quite so powerful as the advice to turn every page.
Oh, yes.
And, which, I mean, of course, sounds conscientious, sounds like something we should do. But when you're sitting in the Lyndon B. Johnson Library in Austin, Texas, surrounded by how many pieces of paper?
They say 45 million.
45 million pieces of paper. You're not going to turn all those pages.
No.
So at what point, for me reading this book and thinking about your work, Is there such a thing as a biographer's hunch or intuition? How do you know where to look?
Oh, well, these are very good questions. I'll give you an example. So, of course, you can't look at even a small percentage of it. But when I was doing the first volume, I realized that there was a moment that things changed in his life. So he comes to Washington at the age of 29 as a congressman in 1937. Up till 1940, up to a certain month, October 1940, the letters are, so I said, you can see there's a change. Before that date, he's writing to committee chairman and other powerful congressmen, can I have 5 minutes of your time? After Election Day, November 5th, 1940, they're writing him, Lyndon, can I have a few minutes of your time? So I was then talking to a notorious Washington fixer, I don't think anyone here is old enough to remember him, named Tommy the Cork Corcoran. And he used to call me kid. And I said, so what happened in October 1940? And he said, money, kid, money. But he said, you're never going to be able to write about that kid. And I said, why not? He said, because Lyndon never put anything in writing. So nonetheless, I decided to focus on those 3 early years as a congressman because I wanted to paint a picture of what it's like to be a new congressman in Washington. So I said I'd get all the details on that. So I'm going through these pages. I said so that, as I recall, was just, I may be wrong, I think this was just 11 boxes. So it's a lot of pages, but it's doable. And a box has like 800 pages if it's all full. And an unfortunate number of them are full. But I'm going through them, and you're just turning one meaningless letter after another, and you're thinking, well, you've just wasted another 3 weeks of your life. And then all of a sudden, between 2 innocuous letters, there is the telegram. He put something in writing. The telegram is from George Brown of Brown and Root, who were the secret financiers, this huge Texas contracting firm that was financing his career. And it was from George Brown, and it's a telegraph, an old Western Union telegraph form. And it says, Lyndon, the checks are on their way. And on the bottom, Lyndon Johnson has written something like, thanks for your generosity. I'm not talking to anyone or communicating with these 6 people, and the names of the 6 people are there. So then I could cross-reference to theirs files and look for them. And in another one of these boxes, under a folder, which you just have to see it, it's just a huge folder, and some secretaries had just crammed things in it. And it was called, the title of the folder was General Unarranged, right? So you're looking through this, and all of a sudden you find this amazing list. It was typed by one of Johnson's 2 assistants, John Connolly or Walter Jenkins. They both said they typed it. I was never sure which one of the 2 typed it. But it was an amazing document. There were 2 typed columns. In the left-hand column was the name of the congressman who had asked him for money. In the center was a column which said how much money the congressman was asking for. Such small amounts, and today, like need $450 for last-minute advertising. They're cheating us at the polls. We need $700. But in the left-hand margin, in Lyndon Johnson's own handwriting, next to each name, he had written, if he was giving him all the money that the guy asked for, he wrote okay. If he was giving him part of the money that he asked for, he would write okay 300 or okay 500. But next to some names, he had written none. And next to some names, he wrote none out. So I asked John Connolly, what did none out mean? And I'll never actually forget his tone. He said, that guy was never going to get anything from Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon never forgave. Lyndon never forgot, and he never forgave. So you say, so this is how he rose to power. This was his first toehold when he was very young in national power. And you found out, literally, by following this advice that I've gotten as a reporter, turn every page, you found that out.
Yeah. So you've written so cogently about how, with both Johnson and with Moses, your interest is in political power.
Yes.
But and how political power can change a city,
Yes.
a society,
Yes.
the world. But political power, any kind of power, changes personality, too.
Yes.
So I want to stay with Johnson a little bit more. What did you find out about Johnson now coming into this position of power? You know, now sort of being the one sending people away or calling people to him. How did it change his personality?
Oh, I don't think, Parul, that it did change his personality. His personality stayed, to me, you know, he had this terrible childhood. Those of you who have read the first volume know it was a truly horrible childhood. And he came out of that hill country background with a personality that really, to me, stayed the same from his college years all the way through his
It was formed.
presidency.
Wow. Wow. So I'm thinking of something you once said about, we've written about Moses, and that his particular genius was that he could look at a small bit of Manhattan and say, there should be a park here.
Yes.
Can't you see it?
Yes.
There should be a road here. Can't you see it?
Yes.
And when I think about your books and I think about the way that you understand personality and you understand character, one thing that you do for me as a reader that I find very satisfying is you find transitions, you find transitional moments.
Oh.
This is when something has changed for this person, and you're able to nest it in a scene. And I kept wondering for you, and this book has beautiful sections about how you went from journalism into biography. Was there a moment, if you were writing your own biography, what would your transitional moment be when you said, this could be my path?
Well, I don't think there was a moment when I said, this will be my path. The moment when I decided to do a book about Robert Moses, I was a reporter for Newsday, and I had an incident, and it'll take a minute for me to tell you about it. So Robert Moses wanted to build a bridge between Oyster Bay and Rye. I was then a reporter for Newsday, the Long Island newspaper. So he had built across the Triborough Bridge, then the Bronx Whitestone, then the Throgs Neck. Now he wanted to build another one between Oyster Bay and Rye. So I was assigned, just as a young reporter, to look into this. And I found this was really one of the world's terrible ideas. I mean, it would have generated so much traffic that I remember the Long Island Expressway would have had to build 8 additional lanes just to handle the traffic that would have been generated coming down from New England. And the piers of this bridge would have to be so big that the piers would have actually caused pollution in Long Island Sound. So I wrote about this, and Newsday sent me up to Albany, and I spoke to Governor Rockefeller, and I spoke to Rockefeller's council, and the Assembly Speaker, and the president of the State Center. They all understood this was just a terrible idea. So I wrote a story basically saying that the bridge was dead, and I went back to other assignments, and about 2 weeks later, I had a friend in Albany then, and he called me and he said, Bob, I think you better come back up here. And I said something like, oh, I don't think so. I think I took care of that bridge, you know. And I went back and I saw Governor Rockefeller and his council and the Assembly Speaker, and they all thought the bridge was the greatest idea in the world. And it said, you know, everything you've been writing is really baloney, because underneath everything that you're writing is the belief that we live in a democracy and power comes from being elected. So here's a guy, Robert Moses, who was never elected to anything, and he had more power than anyone who was, more power than any mayor, more power than any governor, more power than any mayor and governor combined. And he held this power for 44 years, and with it he shaped this whole city and the whole region. And you, Bob Caro, who's supposed to be writing about political power, you have no idea what this power is, and neither does anybody else. So that's when I decided that I couldn't do this as a reporter. I would have to write a book about it.
Yeah. Your wife, Ina,
Yes.
who you work very closely with and who's here.
Yeah, wherever you are, Ina, stand up.
Ina has...
Well, I don't know where you are.
Ina has once said something very beautiful to me, not to me, but something very beautiful about this stage in your life when you were a reporter.
Oh.
And she said, Bob became a reporter because he felt very strongly that the press was the fourth branch of government. He felt journalism was a crusade to protect democracy. That sounds corny today, but I think it was deeply felt. First of all, it's never sounded less corny, but I think we'd agree. But I wonder if there's also some kind of conscious moral mission animating your biographies as well, as something migrated over from your journalism to the biographies?
I don't think I don't think I would call it a moral. I came to feel when I was a reporter, because of moments like I described, that it was really important for people to understand how the political power really works. And I really wanted to, I got very interested in that really through Robert Moses. You said, here was a guy who, when he was young, he ran for governor of New York State and he lost because people got a look at what he was like. So he lost by what is to this day the largest margin anyone ever lost the statewide. Because, Robert Moses' speaking style was sort of like this, And then he wanted to be mayor, and he couldn't be mayor. So he takes a yellow legal pad into a little room off his office as a park commissioner and invents public authorities in their modern form in a way that he could never be removed from power. So you say, if I can explain this to people, I'll be doing something.
Yeah. I mean, you're explaining this to people, and I've been to your office, and I didn't see a computer. I didn't see a printer. There was no Google in your life. There's no Wikipedia. Tell us about your process.
Well, I think you've described it pretty well. I do my first drafts in longhand. There are a number of drafts on a white legal pad. And then at a certain point, I switch from the writing in pen or pencil to a typewriter, and I type my books. I don't use a computer to write.
Why? Is there a certain kind of virtue in the slowness of it, or in the methodical aspect of it, or even just using your hands as you're doing it? What about it appeals to you?
Well, for me, what happened was I remembered when I was at Princeton, I took creative writing with a really wonderful, elderly, courtly, Southern literary critic, now forgotten. His name is R.P. Blackmer. And you took creative writing, you had to write a short story for him every 2 weeks. And I took this course for 2 years. And he always was very and I always, the way I was always doing it at the last minute. I seem to remember, we used to call it pulling all-nighters to get the story in. But he always had complimentary things to say about it. And I thought I was fooling him. And then the last story I ever handed in to him, he said something nice, and then he said, but Mr. Caro, you're never going to achieve what you want to unless you stop thinking with your fingers. And I remember, I think I said this, but there are moments when you realize someone has seen right through you. I wasn't fooling him at all. And then you become a newspaper person. So I was a really fast rewrite man on Newsday. And in newspapers, then, not to the extent but today, but even then, speed was important. And when I quit to do a book, I remember thinking, I've got to do something to slow myself down and make myself think things all the way through. And really, I decided to write Parul because writing in hand is the slowest way of committing your thoughts to paper. And you sort of have to think more that way.
Well, I think that's one of the great virtues of this book, and something that feels very unique to me as I was reading it is that there are no quick fixes in this book. And actually what you say is that sometimes to develop those relationships, to tell these stories, journalists need time. Even the time to sort of get to a place to ask the questions.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could tell us, and you cover this in the book, but you and Ina moved to Texas.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Well,
when you first moved, and it became what people have said, the piece of prose that you produced, people have said it's the finest prose ever written about Texas, and it's about the re-electrification
Yes.
of Texas. Could there be a less sexy topic?
No, I didn't think so
no,
at
there
the
really,
time.
objectively, no.
No.
And yet, so what did you do to sort of build those relationships and to get people talking to you and to Ina?
Oh, well, you ask good questions. I mean, what happened was, so there were already, when I started the Johnson book, there were already 7 biographies of him written. And they all had a chapter or 2 on his youth growing up in the hill country. So I thought I won't have to spend much time on that. I didn't think any of them had enough detail or color. So what I do is, we would work, Ina and I, in the Johnson Library every day from 9 to 5. And then at 5 o'clock, I jump in my car and I drive out into the hill country, which was then started right at the edge of Austin and went on for 350 miles and was really empty. And I would talk to these people who knew Lyndon Johnson when he was growing up, when he was a young congressman, and I couldn't get them to talk to me. I always used to think I was a very good interviewer and I could get people to talk to me. But the people of the hill country, particularly the women, there seemed to be a lot of widows in the hill country. You would get, they were in a world that I couldn't even grasp. Like you'd call someone to come and interview them, and she'd say, well, you go out of Austin for like 47 miles, watch for the cattle guard on your left, turn left, and then you go for like maybe 30 miles on an unpaved, rutted road, and at the end of it would be the house. And then you would say to yourself, I haven't passed the house in 30 miles. So they're living a life of loneliness that I couldn't imagine, also of poverty. And I said to Ina, you know, I'm not understanding this country or these people. I also couldn't get them to talk to me, frankly. They would all say the same anecdotes. I said, we're going to have to move there. Ina, of course, memorably said, why can't you do a biography of Napoleon? But as soon as we moved there, as soon as they knew, see, when Johnson was president, you know, all these reporters would come down there and stay for 3 or 4 days or a week maybe, and come back and write the true picture of the hill country. So they had a name for them. They really disliked them. They called them portable journalists. And they thought I was one too. As soon as they realized that we had moved there, that we were going to stay, everything changed. And they started to tell me different stories. Does that answer your question?
That does answer my question. No, and I think that, you know, you're so lauded for the work that you do, especially in archives, especially in tracking down people. My favorite story, which I might get you to tell one more time, is the story of this famous picture. I don't know if it's the picture of LBJ being sworn in, but you'd spoken to 23 people.
Well, I don't remember how many.
23. Can you tell the story, or can I tell the story?
Yeah, you can tell the story.
Tell the story.
Oh, you want me to tell the story?
I want you to tell the story. I want you to tell the story.
Well, I guess if you look at the famous picture of Lyndon Johnson being sworn in, so he's there and Jackie Kennedy is next to him, and there, whatever the number of people, maybe
23.
23 people in the room, many of whom were still, some of whom were still alive. I interviewed everyone who was still alive, who was, with one exception. But in the corner of the room, in the back, there's the curly head of a woman bent over a pad. You can't even really see her face. Now, I had been trying to get one of Lyndon Johnson's secretaries, a woman named Marie Famer, who went to work for him when she was 19 years old, to talk to me, and she had never agreed to talk to me. But after I had been literally, I think, trying to get her to talk to me for like 20 years or something, writing, you know, letters and phone calls, etc., she finally did. And she said to me, you know, I'm in that picture. And I said, is that you in the corner? And I said, well, what are you doing there? And she said, I'm checking to see that as Lyndon Johnson takes the oath, he's getting every word right. You know, he taught me, when you have a job to do, you do it, no matter what else. And she said, so I was just focused on, was he getting the oath of, and you said, you know, that tells me a lot really about the power of his personality and what he taught to people. Yeah, there are moments like that, you know, when you asked me a very good question before, when you feel you understand. There's never a moment you feel you understand them. But sometimes somebody says something to you and you say, oh, I got it now.
Yeah.
I got that aspect of it now.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the way here, I was thinking about how unusual the biographer-subject relationship is, in that you probably know some of the people you've written about better than people in your life. You might know them better than they know themselves. You might know them better than you know yourself. And there's no way to really explain that degree of that relationship. It's unlike anything else.
Well, that's sort of exactly right. You know, it's like one layer after another gets unfolded to you. And you go back then and you talk to the, you know, as I said before, I interview people over and over. You know, I would go back to, let's say, Horace Busby and say, you know, since I talked to you, I talked to so-and-so and so-and-so, and they told me so-and-so, and do you remember that? And they'd say, yes, and I remember. And so you really feel you're getting, if you do it long enough, you know, people ask why my books take so long to do. I don't think there's a faster way to do it. At least I can't do it. You have to go back to people until you feel like they're being open with you.
And also, I think what you make clear is it's not just that they're open with you, but then that you can make the reader understand, but also feel what is happening.
Well,
and
you,
see
you
and
tried
hear.
it.
You try.
Yeah.
But you must know something, I mean, because you work so closely with people and their recollections of things. I kept wondering, you must know something about memory, like how our memory works.
Oh.
How does memory work?
Misleading.
Misleading. Yeah. Yeah.
Because, you know, sometimes, well, without mentioning the name of the person, so Lyndon Johnson was running for the Senate, you know, and one of the people who was traveling, well, I can say, it was Horace Busby. So
Busby again.
so he said, you know, I was trying to find out, did Lyndon Johnson always believe in civil rights, in helping people of color?
Yeah.
And Busby, who knew him, you know, from the time Johnson was about 32 or 33 years old, was always trying to convince me that indeed he always did. And then to try to convince me of that, he told me, he said, you know, I remember when he was running for the Senate, we had a campaign stop in a little town in Texas called Cleveland, and the railroad tracks ran through the middle of that town, and the white section of town was on the left, on this side of the tracks, and the black section was on that side of the tracks. And Lyndon Johnson got up to speak, and he said, you know, I'm not speaking, this is till they can come over here. And they came. I said, what a great story, you know. And in my mind, I constructed a whole chapter that was going to be a climactic episode.
Yeah.
So in the course of it, I asking, Lyndon Johnson had, you know, daily campaign itineraries, and he would write notes on them and all. And I got all this. He was never in Cleveland, Texas. But I believe, did I feel that Busby was misleading me? I felt he had told the story so many times that he truly believed it.
Yeah, which is the virtue, again, of going back and getting color and getting people to look at it from different angles. And I mean, also one of the things that you do in this book that feels very, I mean, what you've done in all of your books, but I think what I learned in this particular book is how important a sense of place is in everything you've written.
Well, thank you.
And it has to be, like, these are not, I mean, these are great intellectual histories you've written, but they take place in specific bodies,
Yes.
in specific cities.
Yes.
And there's a fantastic moment in this book where you describe, and I'm wondering if you could share this particular story, about somebody that you interviewed, I think, used to describe seeing young LBJ running
Yes.
to the Capitol every day.
Yes.
A detail that nobody else would make much of.
Yeah.
Okay, so he ran. Maybe he was late.
Yeah.
You, obsessed is strong, but you became very interested in this.
Yes.
It nagged at you,
Yes.
right? So what did you do?
Well, let me just say, because they haven't read it,
Oh, God,
the book
sorry.
yet.
Catch them up, catch them up. Go read the book.
The test isn't until Tuesday. But what happened was I found the woman, when Lyndon Johnson came to Washington when he was 24, they used to call it a secretary to a congressman. I found the woman who worked in the office with him. And she would say, Lyndon Johnson then lived in a little hotel down by Union Station. And she lived, so he would come up Capitol Hill, and then when he got in front of the Capitol, he would always sort of break into a run and run all the way to the House office building on the other side of Capitol Hill. She was coming from the direction, she was rooming in a rooming house behind the Library of Congress. So she was coming this way. And she would see this sort of the same hour, which was early in the morning, something like 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning. And she said to me, something made him, he would always run. And then she said to me, at first I thought it was because it was winter and he came up, he was very poor. He only had a thin top coat. But then it turned warm and he would still run. And I said, well, I wonder if there's something up here, something happened here on this run, or he saw something that made him excited and break into a run. So I can't tell you how many times I walked that same route, and I didn't see anything in particular. And then I thought, but you never did it at the time Lyndon Johnson is doing it, which is about, because both him and this woman, whose name was Estelle Harmon, were ranch children, so they got up with the sun. So I went at that time, whatever the time was, 5:30 or 6 o'clock, and all of a sudden, you said, oh, because at that moment, the sun, so he's running in front of the whole length of the east front of the Capitol. It's 750 feet long, and it's filled with all these pediments and great columns and heroic figures and the friezes. The sun comes up in the east at that moment. So it's striking with its full level force, that east front, and it lights up. It's all of white marble. It lights it up like this blazing white mass. You said, of course, he's coming, desperately ambitious. He's coming from the land of these little dog-run, they call them dog-run log cabins. All of a sudden, he sees in this everything he can have if he succeeds here. So of course he gets excited. So I said to myself, if you can do this scene right, which was an if, you don't have to give people, your readers, a lecture on what motivated Lyndon Johnson to be so desperately ambitious to succeed in Washington. If you do it right, the reader will understand for themselves why he feels like that. Anyway, I don't say I succeeded in doing that, but that was what I was trying to do.
You're very humble, but not only do you succeed, when I went back and I read that scene after reading the description of the process and working, it's also remarkable how subtle that scene is.
Oh.
It's not overplayed. But I wanted to ask you again about this doggedness, right? This insistence. How many times am I going to walk back and see it again? I'm missing it, but it's there, this hunch. Something is there that's causing this young 24-year-old to run every day in this particular way. And what's interesting, among the things that's very interesting about this book is that, the work of the biographer can be seen, and probably is sometimes, very solitary.
Yes.
There's a lot of repetition. There's a lot of, I've wasted 3 weeks of my life.
Yes.
The thuds of boxes full of documents.
Yes.
But this book is also an anthology of the ecstasies of discovery.
Yes.
Right. And discovery that, again, is solitary discoveries sometimes. And it's, you have a beautiful phrase in here where you describe when you were starting out, even as an investigative journalist. And he said, I wanted to make the document yield its secrets to me. Oh. And I'm wondering where this comes from, where this patience, where this desire to sort of look closely, to believe that it will tell you its secrets, and the ability to sit there and wait there until it does.
I got to tell you, you're complimenting me. It isn't. I don't know where it comes from. I mean, it's quite true that when I was a young reporter on Newsday, I hated having to write a story before I had all my questions answered. You always had it as a journal, that's just part of daily journalism. I always hated that. And when I started to do The Power Broker, I said, if I'm doing a book, I'm not going to start writing until I've gotten every question I can think of answered. So it's not a compliment to me, it's more a desperation, you really feel you want to, you do, I've had it proven to me that what that old editor said to me, that first piece of advice, turn every page, that has proven over and over again to be true. And if you try to find you have these there are wonderful moments. So I said, when Robert Moses, so he's out of power, Al Smith is starting to bring him back to power. He's already 31 or 32 years old. When he's 30 years old, Robert Moses is standing on a line outside City Hall in Cleveland, applying for a minor municipal job. He has a wife and 2 little babies, which he doesn't get. And then Al Smith comes along and starts to put him into power, and Moses starts to dream up this park plan for Long Island. So you say, well, you can either do this, just say what I just said to you, but with some more details, or you can try to find out how he dreamed up this thing. So when I was talking to him, he told me the name of a guy who used to walk around Long Island while he was trying to think of parks and places for parks. And I did get him before he, it's always before they die, a lot of them are dead. But I found him, and he told me, what it was like to walk with Robert Moses all day with his long strides, saying, can't, we'll put a park here or something. I said, that's so wonderful. And then, so when I got to talk to Moses, I asked him how he thought of Jones Beach, and that was, so it's all like, I might not have asked him in that detail if I hadn't heard it. And he told me this great story, how when he was whatever this age was, I don't want to figure, but it's in his early 30s. One summer, before he really has any power, but when Smith is starting to listen to him, he and his wife Mary and their 2 little girls rent a house in Bayshore for the summer. And he rents a little, what he called a putt-putt motorboat, with a little canopy. And he said, I fell in love with the Great South Bay. And every morning Mary would give him a couple of sandwiches, and he'd take this boat out alone. And his attention started to be attracted to the barrier, this low-lying sandbar. And he went over, and he would talk. He said, every time you got out of it, you couldn't get close. The reeds were so heavy. I'd get out and roll up my trousers, and you saw, as he's talking, because he had a wonderful gift for words, you saw the young Robert Moses pulling this boat through the reeds. And he would tell me how when he came out on that sandbar, where what we now know as Jones Beach, there was not one human being there besides him. And Al Smith was saying, you got to find a place, the poor people of New York, the Irish, now they're getting enough money, they can buy automobiles, but they have no parks to go to. Find them a place where they can have parks on Long Island. And he suddenly realized, I'm standing on this strip of great white sand, and I'm only 25 miles from Times Square. If I can just think of a way to get a road out here, they will have their beach. And he said to me, that's how I thought of Jones Beach and the Southern State Parkway. I thought of it all in a moment. So now I'm interviewing Robert Moses, and now he's 78 years old. And he wants to continue the road past Jones Beach all the way down the length of Fire Island. And when he saw, I didn't really think that was a good idea, because the road would actually have been wider than Fire Island in a lot of places. He grabs me by the arm, and I think I say in the book, because I've never forgotten it, he was then 78, but I can still feel, he drags me out on the deck, and he says to me just what you said, can't you see there ought to be a road there, And you suddenly say, oh, God, this is a whole life, and it's a great life to write about, to tell you the truth.
So maybe one last question from me, and then we'll open it up to everyone here. So, I mean, what a life to write about. We've got one more volume of the great Johnson biography. Who else could have compelled you to write about? Who else might have been a worthy subject?
Oh, well, if you had an unlimited lifespan, there's another book I'd like.
I grant it here.
I'd like to do Al Smith. Al Smith fascinates me. And Oscar Handlin, the historian, once said Al Smith is the major American historical figure most forgotten by history. Franklin Roosevelt once said to Francis Perkins, his Secretary of Labor, Francis, 90% of everything we did in the New Deal, Al Smith did first in New York. So here's a guy, I'd love to do that biography. There are other books I'd like to do, but I'm going to just try to finish this volume first.
So we have some microphones set up. If anybody wants to come and line up and...
Thank you for everything. So you said that Johnson's personality was formed at such an early age, and you can see that in your books. After Path to Power, the first volume, I thought for sure that Johnson would stop at nothing, and I had this theory that he must have been involved in JFK's assassination. But then, of course, you said you had no evidence that was ever something. But did you ever consider it, knowing what you know about Johnson's personality, that he would stop at nothing?
Did I ever consider what?
Whether Johnson was involved in the JFK assassination.
I have never found a single piece of evidence anywhere to suggest that.
And that's what you've said. But I guess my question is, did you ever think that you would find something like that as you were searching through the evidence?
Well, to tell you the truth, it was so long, I've been doing this so long, I can't honestly answer your question. I can't remember, because right at the beginning, I learned how, when you start to read about it, and you read the letters going back and forth before the assassination, you read where he was the day, you really feel that's never really a possibility. There's, as I say, there's never the slightest reason that I found I am aware that there are all these books. Roger Stone, who's been attacking me for like 30 years, but I didn't realize how great a compliment that was to me. He wrote a book called, with a very subtle title, LBJ Killed JFK, But I don't believe he's got a piece of evidence either.
Well, if anyone would know, it's you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Do some political leaders operate with fundamentally different modes of power than Lyndon Johnson did and that you explore in your books? Or do political leaders generally operate with something maybe repackaged that you've explored in your books?
No, I think Johnson in many ways, I don't know, I'm not an expert on all of the people who exercise political power. I think Lyndon Johnson was unique. And the reason I feel he was unique had to do less with his presidency, but with his time in the Senate. Before Johnson becomes majority leader in January 1955. So since the days of Webster, Clay, and Calhoun, the Senate was a great body. That was the 1850s. Between then and 1955, 100 years or so, the Senate is basically the same dysfunctional mess that it is today. Johnson becomes majority, and the leader just before Johnson, Alvin Barkley of Kentucky, says, nobody can lead the Senate. I have nothing to threaten them with. I have nothing to promise them. Johnson becomes majority leader. In like a month, he conceives of all these ways of giving himself power, means of things to threaten them with and to promise them. The Senate starts to work. It works for 6 years. For 6 years, the Senate is the center of governmental energy and creativity and ingenuity in Washington. It's not Dwight Eisenhower's civil rights bill, it's Lyndon Johnson's civil rights bill. He leaves in January 61 to become president and vice president. Instantly, the Senate reverts to the same mess, and it stayed in there. So you said, this is a guy so unique that he could do something that no one else has done in 175 years. So I think Johnson, he's in exercising political power, he was unique, yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I have always wondered why Robert Moses hated his brother so much.
Oh.
Because he treats him so horribly. It's tragic, the way he treated him throughout his whole life.
Yes.
And the quick second question, you said that you asked Robert Moses a question when you interviewed him, and that was the end of the interview, and he wouldn't speak to you after that. What was that question?
That's a very good question.
Well, let me answer the second thing about the question first. So what it was, when Robert Moses was building the Northern State Parkway, he intended it to run on a straight line through the north, just as it starts out in Nassau County, in the north part of the county. But you notice that in two spots, if you look at a map, it makes this big swerve south, then it sort of comes back up, and then it swerves again. So I couldn't understand what the swerves were. While I'm going through the papers of Franklin Roosevelt when he's governor, I find a letter from, I won't bore everybody with the whole story again, basically saying, if you don't make that parkway run away from the, saying, I know why the parkway swerves like this, and if you don't do something else that he wanted, I will reveal it to the public. And the phrase is, and it won't make a very creditable chapter in the history of this state, which is correct. And what had happened was, Moses didn't do this for money for himself. He was never interested in money. He was just interested in power. But the legislature didn't want him to build the Northern State Parkway through the estates of the great robber barons. So they weren't giving him money for even surveys for the route. So the route was supposed to run across the golf course of a very wealthy man named Otto Kahn. And Kahn said he'd give the Long Island State Park Commission $10,000 if they found a new route for this parkway. And Moses did, and he moved it south. So I was trying, the first 6 interviews, they were sort of like monologues. You'd ask him one question or something, he might talk for an hour and a half, real lessons in power. I mean, he was teaching me something over, so many things. As soon as but there came a time I had to start asking him questions, and I wanted to know about this, and as soon as I mentioned, so I worked out a wording that I thought was sort of innocuous, but he was a lot smarter than me. The minute I mentioned the name Otto Kahn, I could see his eyes change. I wrote this, and shortly thereafter he said, well, that's enough for today, and I never got to see him again.
And about Moses and his brother.
And sorry?
About why Moses, in your opinion, without psychoanalyzing him, hated his brother so much.
Oh. Well, I don't know why he hated his brother. You know, that's, I mean, I have my ideas, but they don't find their way into the book because I don't know them. But I will say that I'm so glad that you mentioned his brother because no one ever asks me a question about him. That was the saddest thing. You know, the brother was so poor that he lived in the fifth floor walk-up in South Ferry. By the time I was interviewing him, he was whatever he was, in the late 70s or 80 years old, and he was literally, he couldn't get up the stairs. We'd have to stop at each landing for him to catch his breath to go on to the next thing. And his brother, who at that time, you know, was building tens of thousands of apartments in New York, wouldn't give him an apartment. I thought that was sometimes when I would spend a few hours with Paul Moses, honestly, I would come home and I just have to have a couple of drinks now. It was so sad, yeah.
And gave them a bill for the legal fees for their parents. I'm sorry, for the parents'
That's a-
parents' estate, which was so sad. Thank you. Sorry.
Yes, ma'am.
As a little preface, I'm reading The Power Broker in my high school history class.
I'm not going to be able
She's, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I wrote this down, but so I wanted
Thank
to
you.
know whether you think the way Moses was able to amass power could work in today's political environment in order to get needed infrastructure built more quickly and efficiently.
So is the way that Moses was able to amass power, could that work in today's
Yeah.
time?
Yeah, that's,
In like building infrastructure.
In building
more
infrastructure and building buildings.
yeah. The times change, so it's difficult to answer your question. The thing about political genius is it finds a way to do something where no one else thinks there is a way, like what I said about Johnson in the Senate. No one thought the Senate could be led, and he does it. No one thought anyone could get civil rights bills through the Senate. When he's president, he does. Robert Moses thought of something completely new, He invented a form of power. He managed to get the legislature to pass the law enabling it without them ever knowing what was in these laws, And you say, if he came along today, he might find there will be another genius coming along who finds a way to do something. It's not always, or I think usually the same way, but that's the nature of political genius, that he finds a way where there doesn't seem to be one. That's the best I can answer that.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. Hi.
Hello, Mr. Caro. Thank you so much for speaking. It's a real pleasure to see you. I'm interested, the subtitle of The Power Broker is Robert Moses and the Fall of New York.
Yes.
Now, you published this book in the mid-'70s in a particular time of misery and dysfunction. And I was wondering how you feel about this title, the subtitle in retrospect, given how sort of prosperous and almost gilded New York City is now.
Yeah. Well, New York is prosperous, but New York is still, to take one thing, a very segregated city. When Robert Moses was doing his huge urban renewal projects, he was shipping the people he displaced to the Rockaways because they were invisible there, and these bungalows have been used for that kind of housing for now, whatever it is, 55 or 60 years. Low-income housing projects he would build only in low-income areas. And perhaps easiest for us to grasp right now, when Mayor O'Dwyer gave him sort of complete power in the city over public works, I think the years in my book, I think it's 1949, there's a chapter there called Point of No Return. The state and the city were passing this huge bond issue, which was supposed to go primarily to renovate the subways, to maintain them, because maintenance had been stopped all during the war. Moses, through this series, watching it, in one place you're horrified because you see the results, the other thing you say, boy, this is smart. He manages to get all that money allocated to highways, the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, the Verrazano Bridge, the second deck on the George Washington Bridge. None of it for the subways. We're still paying for that. When you say, why are the subways, I'm going to stop going off on a rant here. When you say, why haven't the subways, has this maintenance been deferred for 3/4 of a century? It really dates back to his genius in getting the money for his own projects. So I don't think that, when I say the fall of course, in 1974, when I wrote the book, the city was bankrupt and all, but the conditions that the suburban slurb on Long Island, because he starved the Long Island, railroad, because he regarded it as a competitor for his Long Island Expressway and his toll booths. All those things impact our lives every day, what he did. So I'm not unhappy with the subtitle.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Hi.
Hi, just to echo everybody else, thank you so much for speaking. It's a big honor. And I'm a political reporter at CNN, and I do a lot of research And my question is, and sometimes I do interviews, but usually research. And so my question is, when you interview individuals who aren't part of the political media system, just ordinary people, how do you balance getting answers to questions where you already know the question based off your research versus how do you entice them to give anecdotes and stories that you don't even know exist?
How do I?
So basically, in a nutshell, I mean, there's the answer. So he wants, it's a question about interviewing, and how do you get not just the answer, which you might already know exists, but the anecdotes, the story, the color, as you refer to it. Are there any?
With ordinary people or with officials?
Ordinary.
You know, I
With
find
ordinary
a lot of it, it's not that I'm such a great interviewer, it's just that I keep going back, you know. But, you know, people want, a lot of times, as I say, people have told the same story so many times that they believe it's true, even if it's not true. But I think when I think back on people who have been the most helpful, like we just say with Lyndon Johnson, Horace Busby, who I've mentioned, George Reedy, who was press secretary, John Connolly, who was the governor who wouldn't talk to me for about 20 years. We got so friendly, you know, that I could, you know, it's great because you're a writer. I could be writing, and I didn't have to do a lot of baloney. I could just pick up the phone and say to George Reedy, George, when Johnson was talking to George Wallace, was he in the rocking chair or on the sofa? Reedy would say, yeah, on the sofa. I'd say, thanks. I'd go back to typing. So basically, it's not any particular skill that I have. It's more that trying to talk to people enough so they open, or they tell things that they don't even know that they knew at the beginning. That's the only real thing I have to say on that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. So obviously you write about power, but for me, and I think a lot of people, the most poignant parts of the book are when you write about the powerless. We talked about the Hill Country women, we talked about Paul, which were coincidentally parts of the books that made me cry, and also the children that he taught in Texas, and then also the East Tremont displaced residents. And you give so much detail. We get so intimate with them, down to the volume and the weight that the women who were in the Hill Country were hauling water. And I guess I'm just wondering why you felt that, because most historians, most writers might just, you know, say he taught in school a lot of kids who couldn't speak English, but you went and interviewed them and gave them their voice and made it a whole chapter. Same thing with Paul. You really, I am now fervently convinced that Martin Scorsese needs to make that chapter into a movie. And why did you think that you needed to get so intimate with these people who were so powerless? And also, what do you think Robert Moses would think of Hudson Yards?
What was the last sentence?
What would Robert Moses think of Hudson Yards?
Well, in the first place, he didn't build it, so he wouldn't like it. But it's a very apt comparison. I often think he would have, this is the kind of thing he would have liked. But your other question, which is such a good question, you know, why I decided that in order to write books about power the way I wanted to write them, I would have to write about the powerless as well as people with power. That was, you know, you learn these things. I sound now like I know what I'm talking about, but the fact is you learn them as you go along. And I'm getting up to where he's building all these expressways. So Robert Moses is the greatest highway builder in history. So I'm reading every textbook I can find, you know, on highways, and they all talk about the human cost of highways. Not one book says what the human cost is or tries to explain. I just said, I'm never going to write this chapter, I said this to Ina, without showing what the human cost is. And I thought of this way, that I thought my work, I'd take 1 mile of the 627 miles of expressways and parkways he built, and I'd show the human cost of that, what happened to the neighborhood. So that really opened, you know, well, I'll say something. So people, you know, people ask why the books take so long. So at this time, we had been broke for a long time, maybe 3 or 4 years at that time. And I said to Ina, you know, I'm not kidding myself or you, this is going to take 6 months. You have to read you have to find out what that neighborhood was like before. You have to read all the weekly newspapers. You have to interview so many people. But when I started doing it, I said, yeah, this book wouldn't be complete without that, because there is a huge human cost to his projects. And if I can just tell the story of this neighborhood, show people what it's like, and your understanding of what you're trying to do grows on you without you realizing it. So I'm interviewing Robert Moses about the same time, and I'm trying to find the people who moved away because he threw them out of the apartments or because it turned into a slum. And I say, I think in this book, the word I find in my notes over and over again, so now they're living in little apartments in Co-op City, or they're living with their kids, and is lonely, And in my view, no one ever uses the word lonely about themselves unless they're really lonely. People don't want to use that word. I'm interviewing Robert Moses at the same time, and I know this is in this book. And I had come that very, whatever I say, either the day before or that very morning, from interviewing this couple who was actually living up where I said in Co-op City. And I asked them what their life was like now, instead of having their neighborhood. And what they said was lonely. So I asked Robert Moses, whatever the question was, what was, did you ever get worried about losing to them? And because they didn't want the road running through their neighborhood. There was an alternate route 2 blocks away he could have put this road on, exactly the same road. And he said, oh, no, there was no real hardship up there. They just stirred up the animals. So I held fast. And if you wanted to know, I didn't think of this when I was writing the book. If you wanted to know about Robert Moses, it's just, I didn't think of this when I was writing the book. I remember him saying, oh, no real hardship at all. They just stirred up the animals there, so I held fast. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm so sorry, we're out of time, but there'll be books for sale out in the lobby. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much.